Okay, well, let's come back over to our code base, and I have a file open called justws.html and justwsserver.js. So you can make those. I'll show you real quick what my folder structure looks like. I have a folder called video code, and inside of that is where I will put all of the course directories. So this video code directory is going to be a GitHub repo, which I will push, and this section is on native WebSockets, so that's the folder I'm working inside of. All right, so every time we move folders, we'll need to create a new node modules folder is the reason I bring that up, okay? So justws.html, we're going to start off and we're going to put some script tags in here. And at least for now, this is where we're going to do our work. We're going to hop over here to the docs. These are the Mozilla docs. I love W3 Schools if you've used them before. They're great for beginners, but you are not a beginner anymore, and this is where it's at for good, solid documentation is the MDN web docs. So this page is the WebSocket API, and the WebSocket API, which I've referred to in some of the drawings, is an advanced technology. How awesome is that, right? Just stop right there and just relish in the fact that you are using an advanced technology. Awesome, okay? Advanced technology that makes it possible to open a two-way interactive communication session between the user's browser and a server, okay? We've already talked at length about that. Before the WebSocket API, this was not possible, but it is now built into JavaScript to be able to communicate at a socket level with a browser. With this API, you can send messages to a server and receive event-driven responses without having to poll the server for a reply. I mentioned long polling very briefly earlier. We'll come back to polling, so don't worry about it now if this doesn't make sense. But WebSockets are connected all the time, right through the TCP channel rather than through the HTTP channel, which disconnects as soon as everything is complete. Well, back in the old days, we used Comet and/or long polling, which is using AJAX. So you would issue a request to the server, and you would say, I want to keep this open until I get some data back. And until you heard back from the server, the request would just hang. Eventually, if the server doesn't send anything, it's going to get tired of keeping the port open, and it's just going to disconnect you. As soon as that happens, if you're long polling the server using Comet or something, you would just open up a new AJAX request. Say, hey, I want some data. I'm going to wait here until you give me some. And that would repeat until eventually data came through. Now, it kind of gave you the feeling of a real-time socket connection, but one, it's not real-time because it's still totally dependent on when your AJAX request gets there. And two, you're basically harassing the server, so it never made DevOps happy. It was really cool 10 years ago, but WebSockets makes that totally obsolete now, okay? The interface section here mentions the WebSocket, the close event, and the message event, and these are all objects, 3 different objects. They list some tools, and these would all be the server side of things. So they've got down here Socket.io, which is a long polling. We just talked about that. WebSocket-based third-party transfer protocol for Node.js. WebSockets, which is what we are going to use. There's a bunch of other cool stuff here. Keep going down. And that is it. You now know everything Mozilla has to say about WebSockets. Okay, not really. Most of the stuff is under this WebSocket object. So I'm going to click on that. And that brings us to the actual constructor, which is what we're going to use. The WebSocket object provides the API for creating and managing a WebSocket connection to a server. So this is the overall API, this page, which gives general information about the API. Scroll to the bottom and see browser compatibility. It is supported at every level with every browser. Go back forward here, and you can see that down here as well. Okay, so scroll back up to the top, as well as sending and receiving data on the connection. So the socket connection is more or less going to be 2 pieces. It's going to be connecting, and then it's going to be the sending and receiving part once we are connected. And to construct a WebSocket, use the WebSocket constructor. And if we scroll down a little bit, they give us the info for the constructor. It is a WebSocket. You can tell it's a constructor because it's capital. And if I click on it, it shows us here the syntax. It requires a URL, and then the protocol is actually optional, as you can see down here. So let's come back over here, and let's try that. We'll make a constant. Actually, let's do let. We'll call this WS for WebSocket, and we will make a new WebSocket, open, close. And if I console.log WS, this is not going to work. At least it shouldn't work, because they told us right here that a URL is required, but let's just see if it exists. Okay, this is my file. I'm going to refresh it, And there's our error. Failed to construct WebSocket. One argument required. So we got to tell it where to connect to. That's the URL part, and that's what I mentioned earlier on in this video where we've got to have something to connect to. So we have covered the front end part, the JavaScript part. Now we need to come over here and actually create something for it to connect to. I have come over to the WS page for NPM. WS, of course, stands for WebSockets. And if we scroll down a little bit, you can see this. We're in the middle of the week here, so we go back. It is consistently over 60 million downloads a week. So this is an incredibly important module for the entire internet. It is very, very important. And the README here, WebSockets is a simple-to-use, blazing fast, and thoroughly tested WebSocket client and server implementation. One of the reasons it's blazing fast is if we click on dependencies, it has literally zero. There are some dev dependencies, but we won't use those. It's just the fastest thing on wheels when it comes to WebSockets. And yes, we're going to use Socket.io this course. That's what it's about. But Socket.io will use WebSockets whenever it possibly can. We'll look at this again a little bit later. I've opened up Socket.io NPM. Click on dependencies here. WebSockets is not here, but Engine.io, and we'll talk about that later as well. Click on dependencies for Engine.io. It does have WebSockets. So don't worry, you will get this by using Socket.io. It's just you get the other things too that make Socket.io much more practical than just using naked WebSockets. You will get to use this blazing fastest thing on wheels server. They've got here in bold, note, this module does not work in the browser. So I've said this several times, but just one more time, right? This is a node module for the server. Whenever they say client in the docs here, it's always a reference to a back end with the role of the client. We will do one of these in our later projects where we have two servers talking to each other. What they mean here is that the WebSocket node module can be used for two servers to talk to each other. It doesn't change the fact the JavaScript API only runs inside of the browser. Going on, browser clients must use the native WebSocket object. This thing, right? This is what browser objects have to use in order to connect to this. Okay, so we scroll down a little bit, you can see there's a bunch of cool stuff, protocol support, if you want to read more about that, some stuff on compressions, a bunch of examples. I'm going to click on API docs, which brings us to a single line, which sends us on to GitHub and the WebSockets/WS page. So this is the owner and this is the name of the module. And if we scroll down, there are two main classes here. There's WebSocket Server and WebSocket, and then they've got the documentation for events and a whole bunch of other stuff, some errors and whatnot. What we are interested in is the WebSocket server, so that's what we're going to make. Now, we're not going to spend any time on the rest of the API because we are going to learn the Socket.io API. But in order to start at the beginning, we're going to make a WebSocket server. So let's come back over to our code base, and I've got just WS Server open up, and we want to install WS. So before we can do that, down in the terminal window here, I do not have a package.json file, so I'm going to make that by doing npm init-y. This will create a package.json file, and the -y means accept all of the default responses. And then I'm going to run npm install ws. You can do --save, that's not necessary anymore, but I'm going to run that, and we will go over to package.json, and the dependencies are one, WS, and if we open up node modules, there is one module, and it is the WS module. That is incredible. Like, I just can't think of hardly any node modules that I use ever anymore that don't have a zillion dependencies, much less zero. So this is amazing, and this is going to be our starting point. So the first thing we need to do is make a basic HTTP server, and I will show you why here in a minute. So we're going to make a const HTTP, and we are going to require HTTP. This is part of Node.js. The HTTP module just comes with it. Usually you don't bring it in with Express because Express does that for you, so if you're familiar with that. We'll do another const, and we'll call this WebSocket, and we'll set this equal to require WS. The reason I'm not calling it WS here is because we're going to use that a little bit later. It's just a local variable. You can call it whatever you want. But I'm going to put a note here. This is WS is a third-party module, and HTTP is a core node module. So this one we got from NPM, we saw a minute ago, and this one is a core module. So right below that, we're going to make a server. So we'll do const server equals HTTP, create server. We will pass it a callback, which will take rec and res. And inside here, we will do res dot, we'll just do end, and we'll say I am connected. And then down below, we need to listen to it. So we'll do server.listen, and we'll listen to port 8000. Makes no difference what port you choose. It's completely arbitrary. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to run nodemon against my just WS server. And I have hopped over to the browser with a new tab at localhost 8000, and we get our I am connected from our .end. So our server works, right? It's the simplest possible HTTP server you could have. We are not going to use this tab for anything else. I just wanted to confirm that our server was listening and handling HTTP traffic appropriately, okay? So let's come back over to our code base, and we're going to make a WebSocket server. So we'll do const WSS for WebSocket server. We're going to make a new, we'll grab the WebSocket module up here, and if we come back over to the docs, this is what we wanted to make. This class, right, WebSocket server, new WebSocket server. So that's coming out of this module. And we need to pass it an option, and the option is an object. So let's go ahead and put an object in there, and we have a whole bunch of options here. What we are going to hand it is a server. So this is a pre-created Node.js or HTTP server. That's exactly what we are going to send it. So I'm going to drop in their server. This is fine. This is ES6 syntax for that, but since they're the same, we can just leave it like that. And this creates a WebSocket server that's going to listen to this. So we're telling our WebSocket server, which is coming from the WebSocket module, to listen to server. Server is this, which is created HTTP traffic or listening for HTTP traffic on port 8000. Okay, so that's the chain. Some HTTP traffic shows up on port 8000. It runs create server. This is piggybacking on that server. So we can come back over to justws.html, and we can fill our path in now because we have something to actually listen to. It's a string, and our path is going to be ws://localhost:8000. Now this is an aberration from what you normally use, right? Normally you do HTTP, but we're using WS. The reason we're using WS is because if we send HTTP, it will hit this server. We want WebSocket traffic. So we want to hit this server. So that's why we have WS: in here. And then the rest of this is exactly the same. Remember, our WebSocket server is piggybacking on our node server, which is just handling HTTP traffic. So we'll take a look here in just a sec at what happens. But first, let's come back over to our justws.html. Let's refresh it. Open the console. And, oh, I forgot we have that console.log in there. We didn't fail to connect this time, which is good because we actually have a URL. And if we open it up, it will show us down here, that's our URL, that's where the traffic came from. And all of this cool stuff, binary blob, buffered amount, all of that stuff, if we go back to the WebSocket API, that is what, oh, wrong one. Go back to the WebSocket object. That's what all of this stuff is here. Binary type, buffered amount, extensions, protocol, ready state, etc. So all that stuff is in here. So we connected, or at least we didn't fail to connect like we did before. So we'll pick it up in the next video and actually see where the connection goes.